Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk FM. Today, we're going to be focusing on the importance of communication in FM. And now more than ever, communication, our communication has to be brilliant. It needs to support our teams and needs to build trust as we return to work. So that's with great pleasure that I welcome Cathy with us today, who is a communication specialist and set up the PR agency Magenta. Cathy also supports the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management and has become chair of the London region. So welcome, Cathy. Congratulations. And how are you today?
Thanks, I'm really pleased to be here. Yes, doing really well. Day 65, is it, of lockdown? I'm beginning to lose count.
Yeah, it feels like most of those days are spent in this room, if I'm honest.
Oh, yes.
I managed to mix it up last week with the kitchen, but the kids have got it again. So, yeah, it's, I don't know about your home working. Have you got an office space that you can retreat into? Or
I sadly don't. I've taken over the kids' sitting room, so their screen time is being very much limited over the last 8 to 10 weeks, which they're pretty cross about.
But there's some plus points in there as well.
Definitely. I do have a quiet space, or quietish.
Yeah. This is, when the government released their guidance, it was great to see that communication was a really key part and high on that agenda. What are your thoughts about the types and the channels of communication that businesses should be using at the moment to understand really that their employees' thoughts, feelings, and their concerns? Because this is part of the journey back into work, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's really important, though, to see this not as just standalone communication. This is very much part of an ongoing communication that organisations have had with their teams. So when we think back to March, which seems a long time ago now, certainly for me, there was that massive exodus really from the workplace. And we saw lots of organisations put home working plans in place in really quite a short period of time. And there was a lot of communications around that. We then have had a long period where a lot of people have been working from home. So there's been a lot of communication over that time as well. And now we're moving on to gradually talking about the return to work. So this is part of a long period of communication. It's not, we mustn't see this just in isolation. And of course, each organisation will have its own way of communicating with people. So there'll be particular tools and channels that they use. There'll be particular tone of voice, for example, if you're talking to legal partners of a big law firm, it might be quite different if you're talking to people in a media company, for example. There's going to be a different tone of voice. So I think we've got to think it's very different for each organisation. But that said, I think there obviously, as you say, there are key ways to do this. I think the key thing to remember is to listen as much as you talk. There's a real tendency, particularly, I think, at emergency situations like this, that organisations just publish information and they're not listening to their people. And as we know, people have very different experiences over the last 12 weeks or so. We've got to remember that some people have been working from home throughout this period, some in quite difficult circumstances. They've got children around. Perhaps if they're on their own, they're feeling really isolated. And they might feel quite different from people perhaps who've been furloughed. So you've got to kind of tailor your communication according to your different audiences. But in terms of different tools and channels, you said there are so much available for people. We've seen organisations use microsites, which act as kind of a central repository of information on that return to work piece. We've seen newsletters going out, particularly if teams have been furloughed. We've seen newsletters go out to them to talk about what the organisation is up to keep them up to date. But we've also got to think this is if we're talking about the return to work particularly, we need to share with people in advance what the plans are, but also communicate a lot once people are back in the workplace, because of course the workplace is going to look very different from how it did when we left in March.
Yeah, I think that's the key, isn't it? To let everybody's own circumstances, should I say, are different. Everyone's returning to work from different circumstances as well. Some might still be working, some might be furloughed. I look at my wife's journey through this whole process, which I'm still surprised companies are not great at communicating with their teams. She started off in a key worker location. She moved into being furloughed. She's then moved into the likelihood of redundancy. And through each of those different processes, she's had very little or no communication from the business at all. And this is a business she's worked in for 16 years. And there are lots of other people that felt very different through that journey, because they've been given the access to the systems at home through actually still working from home to be able to go on to their certain pages and gain their certain information. But because she's one of the furloughed team, she hasn't been able to have access to the systems to be able to get to that information that's been published. And then the management team haven't found a different way to get that out to the wider groups. So some will feel great and some are not feeling so great. And it's how do you bridge those kind of gaps?
I think there's been some really strange way that people have communicated, particularly with furloughed workers. Clearly the rules state that people can't work, but you can communicate with your teams who are furloughed. For example, early in the process, and if you haven't done it, you could do it now. Ask for people's personal email addresses. They're not obliged to give them to you, and they can opt out at any time. But you can communicate to people through their personal email. Just keep them updated about what's happening in the business. We've seen great examples of people having weekly social calls, just so people feel part of that team, so that when the time does come back, and obviously the furlough period has been extended, but whether people are coming back in June, July, August, September, that they're coming back to a team that they still feel emotionally engaged with. And I think that regular communication is a really important part of that.
And you just pointed out, it doesn't have to be work communication. No, you see it on LinkedIn, teams getting together, having a quiz night, using other different platforms like Kahoot and everything else to bring some fun into that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It just doesn't need to be directed around, this is a work communication, this is a work communication. But I mean, I think that's it goes really nicely onto the different styles and types that you might have been seeing companies using. Because it's really important that you get the right response from your employees to any communication. What have you seen that's been successful currently out in the marketplace, and what are companies using?
I think there's different ways of doing this. If we think there's company information, so there's information that the organisation will want to share with its individuals, and that might be through a newsletter or through a company-wide video conferencing call where they're just publishing information. They're just sharing perhaps a company update about how the business is going. So that's one thing, and I think that definitely has its place, particularly obviously with larger organisations. But what's really important and what's going to keep people emotionally engaged is that one-to-one approach. So it's line managers phoning up either furloughed employees or those who are still working and asking, how are you? How are you feeling about things? Whether your workload is too much, whether the kids are driving you crazy with the homeschooling, or if you're furloughed, are you feeling like you're a bit dispensable by the organisation? So it's that whole company-wide communication, but it's also that real personal and team approach, I think is really important. What I think is really interesting as we start talking about the return to work and people are slowly moving back into workplaces is how the communication is going to change. So I've heard lots of different ways of people, for example, communicating social distancing. And I think that's going to be really fascinating to see how that develops and really different approaches. So there's one organisation who has basically, they're setting up their workplace to account for social distancing really well, very professionally done. And then they're going to let people to it. If people choose to ignore social distancing, there's not going to be any comebacks. They're not going to police it. Whereas another organisation is going to actually hire extra security officers to patrol the building to make sure that people are socially distanced. So we've got two quite different forms of communication and management there. And I think it's quite interesting to see how that will develop.
Yeah, and I guess we're talking around a lot around employee fear and concern of returning back to work, but there's also the employer concern as well. The employer is entering into a territory that they don't understand, they've never experienced before, and that's the same for the employee. So they're both building what they think is the right way, and we talked about communication to start with. We're talking around adult to adult communication, around entering the workspace. So, what are your concerns? How are you feeling? What's the risks that you're seeing? And how can I work with you to make you feel better? And we've just shown it there in your explanation that there then can be a tendency based on some outcomes to move to that sort of parent-child communication, which is sort of the more tell style. And then there's absolutely going to be times that we need to introduce that, but it's getting the balance of those styles of communications correct. Where have you seen the two styles are going to be really important? I mean, I personally think something like signage is going to be really important. I mean, is that more tell style, or is that more adult to adult kind of centric? What are your thoughts?
I think you're right. We are all adults. We're going back to the workplace as adults. But I don't know whether you've been to your local Tesco's since lockdown has happened, but they're mostly adults going around Tesco's, and there are really good signage, and yet people ignore it. So I think some organisations are going to be concerned, and they may stray into that adult, that sort of parent-child communication. I think that can be risky, because if people feel they're being patronised or being talked down to, then there's a risk we all come a bit rebellious, and we think, actually, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to sit next to that person or whatever it is. And there are reasons for social distancing which are well explained. So I think we've got to be really careful about straying into parent-child. I think there's definitely a place for it at times. Let's not forget that, anyone, if you've been on LinkedIn over the past few weeks, there are lots of warnings about an employer's duty of care when people are coming back into the workplace. There's threats that employers could be sued for people catching COVID-19 at work, or even secondary contamination. I've seen a couple of articles from legal experts comparing someone's family catching COVID to secondary contamination from asbestosis, for example, which has been quite successfully litigated against. So employers are going to be worried. They're going to want to keep their people safe so that they're not sued, but also because obviously they want to keep their people safe and to do the right thing and make people feel comfortable about coming back to work. I think the key to that is this adult to adult, talking to people about what their fears are. And if you have been talking to your employees throughout this whole period, then line managers will have a really good idea about how people are feeling, and then they can feed that back further up the chain, and organisations will have a really good idea of what people's concerns are, and then they can address those. Yes, I think signage, you're right, is really key. And I've seen some brilliant examples of organisations really changing their workplaces. We've seen things like, for example, putting in single flow systems around organisations. So an up stairwell, a down stairwell. You can only go around an open plan floor in a certain way. And of course, that signage absolutely has to be parent to child. You're just telling people what to do, and it's to keep them safe. I think it's making sure that the communications around that is more adult to adult, asking people what they think, and then explaining why you're doing what you're doing.
Well, I mean, all of that great adult-to-adult communication means that you have a better risk assessment, you have better processes in place. I've seen a lot going on around, cleaning types, technology that people are installing, etc., etc. We won't go into those, but actually, great communication, great understanding of how people use the building, and building, as you said, sort of social distancing rules, flows around the building, access to the facilities, what are you opening, what are you not, is actually going to be the most effective way of keeping everybody safe. Every piece of what I would say comfort process you lay over the top of that probably creates somebody acting in a very different way or thinking the risk isn't there.
Yeah.
And we know full well that social distancing is the best thing that we can all do. So when we're talking around that, it'd be really interesting. We were talking about this the other day. I've been bad on this subject, where you think you're talking about empathy and you're relaying some of your experience to somebody. So they're telling you an issue, they're telling you a problem. You sort of come back and say, oh yeah, this happened to me, that's what we did, and we kind of empathize, or we think. And when we're talking about communication tools, actually that's deemed as quite a bad way of communicating with people. What bad habits should we be looking at stopping when we're going through this process? Because I would have thought that was a good habit, but actually it's proven to be not such a great way of supporting somebody.
I think you're right. It's really easy, particularly at times like this when we're not face to face, because of course face-to-face communication is the easiest and it's the best. It's really easy to get into bad habits. I think the key one is to listen far more than you talk. As you said in that example there, Adam, someone tells you a problem, you're like, oh yes, I've had that problem too, and this is how I dealt with it. And then actually you haven't really listened to that person about how they're feeling about that problem. And I guess sometimes it goes back to kind of those kind of coaching techniques that often we know the answer to our own problems. We just need to perhaps say it aloud and muse on things a little bit. So listen far more than you talk, I think would be my kind of main top tip with that sort of thing. I also think it's a trap that many organisations fall into, is to not communicate enough. They've sent something out once and they think, oh, everyone's got that. But of course, there's no such thing as over communication, especially at crisis periods as we've been in for the last 10 to 12 weeks or so, because people will take in information in different ways. You might send out a weekly e-newsletter, but someone's really busy, they don't check their personal emails or whatever it is, and they miss it. So you need to use lots of different tools and channels to communicate with people, and really do over communicate. And I think also understand that everyone's different. We all take in information differently. You have visual or oral, verbal learners. So some people will really love to have a newsletter. Some people might want a video from the CEO explaining what's going on. Some people will want a chat with their line manager or with a colleague. There's lots of different ways, and people have different learning styles. And I think when you do that kind of group communication, which I know a lot of us have done through Zoom and things like that, it's about creating kind of a safe environment as well. I've seen examples from clients where there's a bit of Zoom shaming, where people are saying you must come onto this call, or they're kind of laughing at people's ideas. And everyone's in a little bit of a sensitive place at the moment. We're all feeling differently about things. So creating that safe environment, not calling people out, and so that people feel that they can contribute. And I think just involving staff in everything that you do, checking back on them all the time. I think not doing that is a bad habit we can definitely get into.
And it's relaxing some of your probably preconceived views. As we've spoken about, my 4-year-old could enter this room at any moment and cause mass destruction to this interview. But actually, that's okay. That is just about the situation we're in. We're working from home. The boundaries of home life and work life are blurred slightly more. And it's just about understanding and being caring. I was speaking to someone the other day, and it was called out that I think it was their dog that got involved, and it was unprofessional, and it was called out within the meeting. And you just didn't. It doesn't need to be that way. Pause for 2 minutes. It's done, it's dealt with, and you move on. We all
I don't know about you, but I found it fascinating over the last few months, just chatting to people at home, because it's really quite rare, isn't it? In the past, people might do an early conference call at home, but generally you didn't see people's home backgrounds. I'm quite a nosy person, and I've loved that. And also I feel a lot closer to not just my colleagues I was already pretty close to, but some of our clients and other people in the industry that I've chatted to, just because you can see their home environment. I can see kind of what's behind you. It can become a talking point. We've got a colleague who's got have quite a number of children, and he sometimes works in his son's bedroom, sometimes he's in one of his daughter's bedrooms, and the background becomes a talking point. And I think we've all become a little bit more human, I think, as a result of this, and perhaps a little bit kinder and more compassionate about the dog and interrupting, or the child running in, or whatever. So I think it's been really positive in many ways.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree. You don't get this is windows into people's home lives, isn't it?
Brilliant, yeah.
And you get to know the person slightly more than you would do going into a business environment and sitting around that table. Because people are warning. Oh, by the way, I'm in the kitchen. My child might come and ignore me. Oh, I've got a dog, and you start talking about completely different subjects for 5 minutes, and that's been really, really nice, especially when you are. As we're talking to people that we know and people also that we don't know, and you get to know them a lot quicker, and you build that rapport. I think a stronger rapport through the whole process,
which you wouldn't necessarily think you would do, would you? Because we've been, and it's right that face-to-face communication is more powerful, but I think people put on a bit of a suit of armour when they go to someone else's office or whatever it is, which you can kind of break through when you're video conferencing from home.
Yeah, I think that leads us on to thank you, Mark, for sending in your question. The irony for us is that the current situation has brought teams closer together, despite not having seen each other for 9+ weeks, with regular joint Spotify playlists, twice a week video conference calls, and using the mobile instead of email more. And I think that's true. We got into such an email culture, didn't we? That you could be sitting next to someone and you'd be sending them an email. Now that email doesn't really sort of exist because you can't see that they've read it, and you're actually talking about phoning them up or jumping on a Zoom call. We seem to have really adapted the way that we are approaching our working relationships very differently. So
I think also, I agree with Mark's comments. I think that's really true. But also, we're having conversations about deeper things than before. When would you have ever phoned someone up and say, "How are you feeling?" No, really, how are you feeling? And actually, that's okay now. And people will be like, "Oh my God, I'm having, it's been so up and down. I'm having a really bad day, and the homeschool is going really badly. The Wi-Fi's been down, and people are much more willing to open up and talk about mental health. And I know that it's something we have talked about quite a bit over the last couple of years. But this has been the real leveler, hasn't it? That people are prepared to say, "I'm having a bad time today," which they wouldn't necessarily have done before.
And I think this goes back to some of this where people have been at home, so they're communicating in what they class as their safe place, where they feel safe. And then when they come to an office, it might be that, as you say, they have to put on some shields and some guards, not to be themselves and get through that process because of whatever's happening in their life. Currently, we're sitting in our homes, the place that we should feel the safest, and that actually are the safest at this precise moment in time. So it's probably dropped a few of those guards to create some great conversations. And let's be honest, we've become more relaxed. As I say, I would have no issue with Max running in this room now and having to deal with that situation. And I think that just changes the way that you feel about meetings and communication with people. I think it's I hope it's going to be one of the positives, because as we spoke about sort of last week, mental health is going to be key. That open communication, that honesty is there as we do return into work. For the people, whether they've been on furlough, whether they've been working from home, their journeys are going to be slightly different. And it's that personal touch to each of their individual cases that I think is going to be really important. But saying that, video conferencing is different. It is a different media to talk through. And I've seen some presentations coming around about some pitfalls, like there will always be, about expression. You're live all the time, people can see you all the time, that you can see more of the group. Are there any pitfalls that you've seen through this method of communication?
Definitely. I think, certainly that there are ways to do video conferencing and ways not to do it, aren't there? I've seen lots of examples of people who are on video conferences on mute and clearly just answering their emails or getting on with work. And that's not the way to do it. It's a sort of discourtesy, isn't it, to your fellow participants. So I'd say keep your attention on the topic, be an active listener, show people that you're listening, and you can do that by nodding, asking questions or whatever it is. So be engaged with people. A lot of us, and I'm sure you're the same, Adam, we spend a lot of our times on video conferencing at the moment. So use that time wisely. And why have an hour and a half call if you only need 20 minutes or whatever? So be actively engaged throughout the call. And if you are the one talking, be engaging, ask people questions. Don't, we all have been on the end of a monologue, haven't we? Which we all perhaps drifted off a little bit. So get people engaged with what you're talking about. Keep things relevant and on topic when you're in a meeting, face-to-face meeting. That little anecdote might be fantastic, but on a video conferencing, you really need to keep things quite succinct. And it's acknowledge, as you said, people's challenges. If someone's child or dog or whatever it is runs in, or their Wi-Fi connection cuts out, just acknowledge that that's a bit of a challenge, and keep your sense of humour about stuff. One bit of information, a tip that I heard quite early on in lockdown was to cover yourself up when you're on the screen, because you can get distracted by looking at yourself. It's a bit like sitting opposite a mirror if you're in a meeting room. So I always cover myself up so I can't see what I look like. Otherwise, I get horribly distracted and start thinking that I need a lockdown haircut or whatever it is. And just focus on your fellow participants and not yourself. But it's an unnatural way to communicate, isn't it? And we've all had to get used to it.
Yeah, and it is much easier, I think, to get distracted. I mean, there are times when you've been talking to somebody and you thought, oh, actually, I'm not sure about that. Let me just go onto the internet and search something out for you. And you can, there's times to do that. But there's also, as you say, bad habits because your phone's there. You're not quite in the same room. It's an interesting one. So you do have to, as you say, keep it short, keep it succinct, try and get the information across. But Mark has even said here, humour is important. We've just said that. We've asked our teams to score their current lockdown mental health. And it's a good way for people to speak how they are currently feeling. A good old barometer of a score. Again, we've just spoken about it. Not all communication needs to be corporate. And sometimes corporate doesn't get the best information back to yourself, especially about how people are feeling. So it's mix up the different styles. And
I think that's really true. If you think about, if you're on furlough and you get a call from your CEO, say you're in a quite big company, you get a call from the CEO, that's terrifying, isn't it? And if the CEO says to you, how are you feeling? You'd be like, I'm feeling fine. and all you are going to be is worried about your job. Whereas if you get a call from your line manager or a colleague saying, how are you feeling? You're going to open up. So I think that you're right. There's a real difference between one-to-one, sort of peer-to-peer or line manager to team member communication and that overall company comms.
But I've seen some companies that they've just taken a colleague and put them into sort of a furlough communication role. That said it asked them to call all the people and get in contact with them to see how they're feeling, because they don't even feel like they're talking to a boss within the business. They're talking to a colleague. They're talking to someone that's probably more open about the way that they're feeling and some of the insecurities.
We've seen furlough champions. So as you said, someone from that team who's perhaps also coordinating social activities, but also a nominated person to perhaps call around a couple of people and see how they're feeling, and also return to work champions. So someone who has a sort of small group of people and can talk to them, first of all, about how they're feeling about the return to work, but also once they're back at work, how they feel about the efforts the company's made to keep the workplace safe and communicate those, and also communicate back how those team members are feeling. So I think that, again, that sort of one to few communication is really powerful.
Well, I think this is the thing, isn't it? It's where we concentrate some of this on the return to work, but it's also that the whole journey through work, because businesses are starting to bring back a very small number of people. I heard on the webinar you held the other day that people were hoping to get about 30% of their workforce back into their offices by the end of this year, and we heard on about office design. The office design under social distancing, the capacity is going to be about 50-60% in its entirety. So there's quite a long journey to go from the initial first few people that come in and stress test your processes and procedures, and you get that constant feedback all the way through to suddenly having, hopefully the early part of next year, having that 60% number of people back in the offices. And then you've got people working from home that used to go into the office, and so this is just a real start of a communication journey, isn't it? And getting people back into the office isn't the end.
No, I think we're going to be talking on video conference for quite a way to come. I mean, this stage reoccupation, organisations are going to do it in lots of different ways. And we might have sort of staggered start and finish times. We'll have pilot phases with, as you say, 10, 20, 30%. We'll have shift patterns. We'll have split team workings, lots of different ways that organisations are doing it. And I think the key is for those businesses to communicate, obviously, why they're doing that. And I think it's obvious, but also how that's going to work. And how you can communicate with people who aren't in the office. You don't want to have the dreadful situation where someone has braved public transport and turned up at work only to find that they're in on the wrong day and they're not allowed in. So that can be a real comms piece to talk about that stage reoccupation, and then obviously to talk about the safety measures that have been put in place, things that the organisation has done to keep people safe, and then finally people's behaviour, how their behaviour has to change in the workplace to keep them and others safe. So it's a big communications plan, I think, that's being put together all around the country with different organisations to get over this next few weeks and months.
And as we've just said, and that just doesn't focus on one style of communication either. So you might have to say the same message in multiple different ways to reach multiple layers of your organisation.
I think that's really true. And also, as well as using lots of different tools and channels, I think it's really key to keep the information fresh. You can put up posters on day one or comms on day one, and everyone's going to read it because we're all going to be engaged about what we need to do. But that will very soon become wallpaper and people will ignore it. So I think it's really key to constantly change that information so it does become fresh and people still read it, and we don't slip back into our ways that I'm certainly seeing people in the supermarkets are of starting to ignore social distancing because they just ignore the signs now. We've got to, in workplaces, really make sure that things stay fresh.
Yeah, I agree. As we go into an area of grey with regards to the overall message of lockdown, and as we move back into business, grey becomes an interpretation, doesn't it? Interpretation leads to different people's views and using their own instincts to make their decisions. Supermarkets, we have to be strong with what we're doing and be able to keep those, rebranding the same messages and sort of, I guess, don't get lax in our own management of some of the processes we've put in place. Keep our staff engaged in it, keep our staff understanding that social distancing is the key to success of getting back to normal as much as possible. It's just an interesting one here. How have you kept your business going during lockdown, and how do you see your business coming out of lockdown? That was from Francis. I mean, we've just talked about how important communication is. You guys are a specialist in this area. What impacts and changes have you seen within your own day-to-day?
I guess it's been easier for us because we're a small business. So there was 12 of us at the stage where we all started working from home. Like everyone else, we heard the announcement on the Monday evening that everyone should work from home. We all packed up our laptops and went home. One of us has been in the office once a week since then for insurance purposes, but we've all worked pretty well since then. We've instigated some of the things that I've talked about already on the call. So we have a 4 p.m. social call every day, which is a chance for just people to talk about how they're feeling. We have quizzes on a Friday with a glass of wine, and when it's people's birthdays, we have sort of virtual parties where we wear hats and people open presents and all that sort of thing. So for us, it's been very much, we're a comms agency. We've got great tools that we already use to communicate with one another. So it hasn't been too bad. It's been quite a learning curve with some of our clients who haven't been in that position. We work with some big FM sales providers, for example, who've had to furlough a large number of staff, and we've worked with them on the comms plan around that. And that's really different. When you've got 5, 6, 7,000 people in your business. That's very different from when you've got 12. I mean, I wrote on the day that we went into proper lockdown, I wrote a card to everybody in the business, which I posted in a kind of, we'll get through this type of thing. You can't do that with 6,000 people. So it's very, very much easier to communicate in a personal way in a small business, much harder, I think, in larger organizations.
Yeah, and you've taken on the chair role at the IWFM London region. So a good region, very complex region to look after. The IWFM have had some great sessions come out for the members. What is it you're looking to bring into that area and further, I guess? What were your goals when you took the role?
Well, obviously, not a great time to take on a role where we're known for running really good events and suddenly we can't run anything at the moment. So we cancelled, obviously, everything that we had, including our lovely summer party, which is always a really, really great event. So that was quite sad, but we've very quickly turned things around. I'm really keen. I love a webinar. I think it's a great way for us to communicate during this time. If you're furloughed, it's a great way to learn things and keep in touch with people. And just generally a really good learning tool. So we ran our first webinar I chaired last week with the IWFM as part of their Turbulent Times series, which was about the return to work. We had about 600 people on it. And usually we would have maybe about 80 people at our events. So it just goes to show the power of that. And it's much quicker and easier to organise a webinar than a face-to-face event. We're also, in the next couple of weeks, starting a pilot event, which is going to be a one-to-one interview with one of the members of the committee and someone running a landmark site in London to talk a little bit, sort of bit of an insight into their career, how they got into their current role, and also what they're doing at the moment, both in terms of the pandemic, but also in terms of their wider role. So a bit like your sessions, Adam, they're going to be reasonably short and just a chance for someone to get that insight into people. I mean, imagine hearing about what's happening in the Cheese Grater or 22 Bishopsgate or whatever it is. I'm really hoping to get some landmark sites there. So that's the plan.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's getting FMers telling their stories, and people being able to learn from each other. This is time that learning is so quick on subjects that we've not really had to face into. One of the reasons for Let's Talk FM was that to try and get great people on, just to tell their stories and give some information to the people that want to listen as we move forward. And I hope that I've seen a lot of it, so I hope people are finding it really helpful. So thank you so much for joining us today, Cathy. It's great to have you on board. Lots of good information for the people that have tuned in. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Take care and see you all next week. Thanks a lot.
Adam.
Bye.